So I've got some prepared questions that we're going to sort of start off with, and then we can open it to the floor. We've got quite a little bit of time, so there's plenty of time for the conversation to go in whatever direction it does. Patrick, I wanted to start with you. So if community wealth building is about creating a fairer and more socially just economy, could you say a bit about I know we've heard from Naomi about the issues with how we currently think about and use and develop our economy, but from a well-being economy perspective, do you want to come in a little bit more on that?
Yeah, okay. Well, hopefully you can hear me. If I drop down a bit, because I do tend to speak quite quietly, put your hand up and wave at me and I'll try and shout. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Naomi. Well, I don't know if I'm going to say thank you, Naomi, because I was pre-warned about that question, and you've actually given most of the answers, so I'm actually sort of thinking my feet a bit. But
people forget really
just in case you weren't listening to Naomi, let me just repeat a few points. I guess the starting point is the paradigm around which we've designed our economy, and it's important to know that, well, remember that the economy is a social construct. It's what we make it collectively. So we've designed an economy, maybe not people in this room, but collectively, which is built around the paradigm of growth and the paradigm which looks at GDP and finance as being the key metrics of success. And of course, what none of those do, or either of those do, is tell us anything about the well-being of people, or indeed the well-being of the planet. So the first question I always ask when people talk about growth is, growth for who, growth for what purpose, and what are the consequences of that growth? Because we know the economy extracts, as Naomi said, from people and from planet. And the way that our system is set up at the moment, it isn't distributed evenly. And the impacts of the way that we design the economy is that the extraction from people and place and planet means that we've got rising inequalities, we've got rising climate crises, a rising crisis in biodiversity, and we have growing issues around about housing, about the cost of living, about the things which really matter are important to people. And of course, those measures say nothing about progress. What if, for example, instead of having GDP figures up on the news every month or whatever it is, we looked at things like life expectancy or healthy life expectancy, and we arranged all of our economic activity to drive improvements in life expectancy. And again, Naomi mentioned that mortality rates or life expectancy rates have plateaued in the UK, actually declining in the US, the wealthiest economy in the world, which just shows you that we have a system which isn't working for people. And I think probably just yesterday, the most grotesque example of how the system isn't working was the results of the Grenfell inquiry. And it's horrible to reference it in this context. But, if ever there was a classic case of where deregulation in favour of profit over people, that was the example. And it's systemic. And that's why, from a wellbeing economy point of view, we need to look at a whole system change that puts in place proper governance, proper regulation, and actually focuses the economy on the well-being of people and planet at its priority and at its core. And everything else stems from that, whether it's in terms of the dignity people can expect to live their lives in, whether it's in terms of respect for nature and working with nature and giving back to nature rather than extracting, whether it's in terms of fairness of distribution, or indeed the way that people participate in the economy, whether it's through inclusive activities such as ownership of businesses or business models, or indeed just participating in democratic processes. So we need to rethink the way that we run our economy. We need to think about different measures of what success is like, and we need to design an economy which has the principles of a community wealth building at its heart. Community wealth building is a really practical tool to demonstrate and to put in place the principles of the things that we'd like to see in a wellbeing economy. And the more communities that can embrace that, the more successful our economies will be for people. And I think one of the important things that Naomi ended up with is, we can't wait for politicians to solve this for us. We've got power ourselves, and that power is based in this room and in the communities you come from. And what community wealth building does is gives you a tool to go out and argue for some of the changes which will benefit your communities and your friends, your relatives, your friends, your families, and actually make a contribution to growing the demand for a wellbeing economy.
Yeah, no, I realised when I had to put that question down, obviously, but I think you brought a different perspective and just sort of reinforced quite a lot of those things, so that was really, really useful. Morag, I was going to come to you. So you're an artist, among many other hats, and are very active in your local community, and you've also done work specifically focused on community wealth building. In what ways, I think sometimes there's it feels like there's this big gap between thinking about, okay, we can get community wealth building, we can think about a wellbeing economy, but it feels sort of like the change or the steps to make feel too big or unreachable, we won't make a difference. In what ways, have you sort of tried to get people more involved in thinking about how we work together? I know it's been around sort of land use and assets, but how we work together differently in this way?
Yeah, big question. And, great presentations and contributions so far as well to respond to. Thank you. For me, the most recent thing we've done, my introduction to community wealth building as the sort of concept that, as Naomi's presented it earlier today, came through working with Rob Davison at SOSE, amongst others, and Scottish Forestry, specifically looking about how we could generate community wealth building from new woodland creation proposals. So that was a really good way of sort of investigating the history and context of community wealth building, but also how could we apply it to specific projects and strategies that are happening live in the south of Scotland at the moment. So that's kind of where my particular interest in it came from. And then more recently, I've been working on the local place plan, which many of you will be familiar with from your own communities, and trying to work out anyway, how we can embed those community wealth building principles into everything we want in our place plan. And as well as that, so that's in a more generalist sense of putting a vision forward for our local community and starting to eke out what that might look like, but then also at the same time trying to work with people, with investors that are coming in for land use projects, woodland planting, wind farms, etc., to try and bring this idea forward to them and say, there's lots of things you could be doing with the community here. You could be looking at our community action plans, at our draft place plans, and saying, we could work with you on that. We could contribute there. We could, we're neighbours. We are now part of your community because we're operating in your community. But I have to say, we're not getting very far on that specific interaction at the moment with individual developers as they come along. Because, of course, we're hearing all the great stuff from the government on it and some of our regional agencies, but I wouldn't say it is filtered through to the private sector at all, from what I can tell. Of course, we've got, the wind farm benefits, and they're very welcome, but they can create a bit of a dependency, short-lived culture as well. And we need to sort of find ways of helping to get that money into longer term, more sustainable projects within the communities where the communities have more agency in how that's done. Did you want me to touch on the arts role at this point as well?
Well, actually, I think from that point it would be, maybe we'll come back to that. I think it'd be really interesting to bring in Manish, because the question around that, so, you're involved with innovation clusters, but I also know that you've sat on a lot of organisations that have, I suppose, are these big community anchors, as well, like universities, but Wheatley Housing Association and the Scottish Government, so how do you see those of us really working at community scale being able to work meaningfully and equally with some of these really big players?
And I think the point there is really about power, isn't it? And power dynamics. And those relationships are completely skewed from the get-go, right? Like you're trying to sit at the table with the principal of Strathclyde University, well, he comes with a staff team of 3,500 and a budget of $500 million and everything else. But at the same time, I think a lot of these things are relational, and it's about proximity. And I think when you even think about some of the pilots you talked about, Naomi, it's the individuals that led some of those things, you know, in Ayrshire and Manish and others. It's, you know, people who had a vision and grasped that vision. And I think actually, even in our big anchor institutions, you've got to get close to people, and you've got to figure out a way to do that. Now that's hard sometimes because there are gatekeepers, and there are, you know, somewhere like a university, everything is done by committee, you know, but it's also done relationally. So there's the committee structure on one side, and you know, government's the same actually, unlike from other places. But if you know the right people, and you can actually start to get in front of the right people, so you know, the director generals or the directors, you know, and try and invite them down. And I think a space like this in the south of Scotland, and just even coming down here, it starts to change your mindset. It starts to get you out of that central belt mentality that I think some of us are guilty of having when we're based in Glasgow or Edinburgh. So I would encourage you to try and get ministers and decision makers out to you, to get close to your project so that people can actually see that the impact that you're having. I think we've got to recognise those power dynamics, and I think there's an element there about how we can be much more intersectional around that as well. So, you know, we talk about lots of different isms, and I think capitalism is one of those big isms. But, you know, how can we be much more intersectional and make sure that actually this is about bringing marginalised communities with us, and it's about working closely with them. Government has got a really big role to play in that, and has a, you know, we're not short of papers and reviews and strategies in Scotland, right? We've got loads of them. We're short of political will, I think, and of actually resource to make it happen. But I guess the question I often ask myself is, if it's not us doing it, well then capitalism's just going to step into that void, and it is going to continue to extract from people. And I think, you know, they say never waste a good crisis, and you know, we are in a crisis. We're in a poly-crisis, right? We're not short of challenges that face us, and AI is the next one that's just coming hurtling down the path in terms of automation and thinking about the jobs that are going to be taken away. But there's also an opportunity, I think, in that to start to create a new narrative, try to do things differently. And so I think working with partners, so you kind of mentioned Wheatley there, they're obviously a big house builder here in the south now as well, after kind of merging with Dumfries and Galway Housing. You can get really close to an organisation like that by working with housing officers, by working with some of the leadership, thinking about procurement. I think procurement is not the sexiest thing in the world to ever talk about, but procurement is where the money is. It's, you know, follow the money, and there are billions of pounds. And you know, I think we're now getting some really good examples. So the example of Manchester, I think I know that Glasgow had Andy Burnham up recently. City Council's looking at that. Take the politics out of it. I think there's a lot to learn from other places. So I think storytelling for me is a really key aspect of this. Like, and I think that's where creativity comes into it too. But how do we tell our stories? How do we tell the stories of the projects that you're working on, and how do you get them into government? Because they're often looking for case studies. They're often looking for good practice that they can actually take out there. So whilst it might appear that they're quite hard to access, I actually think if you take the institutional nature of it out and look at the people and try and get in front of the people, then you might get a lot closer to it than you think you could.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I've got, there's lots of bits there around. I think you know, one of the difficulties that we've had is that because say a large anchor organisation has got such a huge amount of staff, then the person that you're talking to sometimes hasn't got the power to make the decisions, and actually then sometimes when you reach the person who's much more at the top, that still doesn't filter down to the practicalities of how you're working with them, but maybe in the storytelling and to the showing what that work could be like.
And I think there's a top-down and a bottom-up approach as well. So you've got to work with people at both ends and try and get to meet in the middle if you can.
In the middle, yeah. So, Naomi, you talked about, you know, obviously in your presentation, what community wealth, examples of what community wealth building can look like at community level if people are maybe doing that bottom-up and top-down approach. And obviously you talked literally just yesterday when I wrote this thing about, okay, we don't know what's happening with community wealth building, all of a sudden it's sort of back on, and so it's like, so there's, you know, hopefully legislation coming into place. You know, so policy change, so, you know, and there was there was a consultation last year, which, you know, I filled out with my minimal knowledge, which I thought was, you know, it was interesting. But I still think that, and we talked about it when we were talking about this event, you know, the role of like smaller anchor organisations and thinking about, which is that bottom-up, top-down approach, you know, in this work. How can we sort of establish those small anchors in the thinking of the large anchors, do you think?
So there's conduits of opportunity. So, sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, grand. I forgot. There's conduits of opportunity, I think. There are things that are in place already. You've got the TSI, I am. You've got a voice that should be sitting at those anchor institution table. You know, that there is a conduit way of raising the collective voice up. There's the community planning partnerships. There are networks and opportunities to start to feed into those. It's like filling this void, we talked about that. But I think there's real value, and we were just talking about this actually first thing this morning, about creating a network, an ecosystem. You don't need to all do everything yourselves. Come together, resources tight. Times are hard, but collectively you can really pool your resources, pool your thinking to look at your area, not necessarily just the one place you work in, but the wider ecosystem around it. Think, yeah, what's the opportunity here? You know, and if you have a relationship with your local authority and you understand that they're procuring things, how can you get in on that? What can that look like? How can that come to your area? How can that meet some of your needs, possibly financial needs? But how can that also feed into meeting their needs? Because most local authorities now are thinking about how they can procure differently, how they can feed wealth into their places. So I think there's a real opportunity about moving away, and it's really hard, I know, because the funding landscape is horrific and you're all competing against each other for the same pots of money. But maybe having a partnership approach, a collaborative approach, is an opportunity to look at securing resources, but also looking at community wealth building and presenting to some of these larger organisations what you can do. Because in my opinion, you guys are all amazing and you're so creative because you have to be.
Yeah. And that's, so before we open to the floor, I suppose, you know, obviously through what we do now, we're really interested in how you can, the role of creativity in this work, to maybe test and trial and think differently, to maybe build some of those relationships that we're talking about. So, Morag, back to you, you know, how do you think, you know, you've got lots of different hats, but do you think that your creative background is important? How is that important in the work that you do?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's hugely important, and I suppose I'm not really just speaking about me, but all of the other creatives I know. You know, many people in the room, and many people who wouldn't actually call themselves a creative, but have that creative way of thinking that addresses some of the things you were just talking about there. You know, creativity and artists bring imagination, stimulation, invigoration, and have different ways of looking at problems and projects that don't sit within that kind of institutionalised thinking that we've become used to. And that, you know, because we need to steer a completely different path, don't we, to achieve the things that we're talking about here. And so I do think artists have a strong role. There's the kind of the practical stuff that's easier to make tangible examples of, like the creative placemaking that, you know, obviously you guys are so good at. There's the helping to tap into the cultural heritage on a local scale when you're talking about local projects and bringing that forward. But then I think really importantly is on the wider landscape of this is getting away from thinking about arts as illustration or something that's nice to have and therefore expendable, and embedding artists right the way through this, you know, from government, policymakers, national strategy, regional strategy, right down to delivery and local organisation. You know, because too often, I'm sure we've all heard this 100 times, you know, the creatives in the room, the project's being designed and then they bring the artists in. You know, we need the artists in the room, on the boards, on the advisory groups, on the steering groups, to bring that creative energy into how you go about making some of these changes in the first place. And I think we're starting to see changes around the edges. You know, we do have an organisation, the Crichton, that has an embedded artist now who is just there to be an artist in that organisation, which is amazing. I remember, Matt, at the Stove, you brought some people from Canada years ago, didn't you, who were embedded in the local water company, for example, and that's really stayed with me as an example. And as a society, I think we need to get much more used to, you know, having that as the norm rather than something. I mean, we've just seen the whole budget cut, haven't we, that everyone's devastated about, because arts is seen as a luxury, and we need to get away from seeing art and creativity as a luxury.
And in those conversations, I think it's back to that real importance of cross-sectoral, you know, it's that power thing, who's represented on those boards and how are people supported to be on those boards and bring diverse experience into that space.
Could I just say, I also just want to make sure as well that what I wasn't suggesting there is that those people are on those boards as advocates for the arts.
No.
They're there because
They're bringing a different
Absolutely.
perspective.
Yeah.
No, exactly. No, that's... So, I'd like to open to questions from the floor. We've not got a microphone, but actually it might work, but yeah. Simon.
How do we get small contractors and medium contractors to get these contracts? Because whenever I've looked into getting a contract, it really advantages big outside G4S type, capital type people who hoover up all these public contracts and do that.
Yeah, we've just entered that a little bit ourselves at Stove. Who would like to come in on that first?
I can have a...
No.
Yeah.
I'll start.
You start.
You
Yeah.
can correct me.
No.
I mean, I think a lot of that starts with the engagement, particularly with the anchor institutions like the local authority or the health board. And the problem with so much procurement is that it's geared towards what they call best value.
Yeah.
And best value is interpreted as price. But actually, best value doesn't have to be price. Best value is best value for the community. And if you reframe the thinking behind procurement, so you look at, you're not just procuring double glazing for a housing development. You're procuring improvements to the house, and you're procuring improvements to the community, which could be training, it could be making sure that you identify local sources for those materials. You can make sure that there are obligations on the contract itself which tie in that community benefit at the local level. So it's really about how do you frame the procurement process and making sure it's not just narrow focus on value for money, because actually the benefits then multiply, which is really the evidence from the community wealth building.
So it's again telling that story of what the value should look like.
Yeah, I think telling that story, but persistently telling that story, because I think part of the challenge sometimes in big anchor institutions is you get your well-meaning colleagues in procurement departments say, oh, well, we do that, we've got a strategy, here's our and the community benefit stuff is just pants, to be totally honest with you. It's totally crap. Like, I just did one recently, and it was with colleagues of mine, and the community benefits menu is, oh, we're going to provide a grad job and we're going to do this and that. There's nothing about, the wider economic impact in the local community. There's nothing about using local suppliers. There's nothing about supporting marginalised communities, supporting, women back into work who maybe been out of the workforce. Nothing that would speak to what's actually going on in the community on our doorstep. And I think part of the challenge is, especially when you look at large public contract procurement, is it's all done through this Scotland Excel framework. And so there is a systemic piece in this. I definitely think there is a piece there. We've got to lobby government, we've got to get in front of people, we've got to use practice like Manchester and others. We've got to show them that there's different ways of doing it. You're great that it's happening in smaller councils, but we've got to try and get that now up into the bigger councils, because the spends are huge, and I know we're living in really tight financial times, but we are still spending billions of pounds across the economy, and so there is money there to go into projects. And I think even just trying to articulate better community benefits might almost give you an opportunity to go and talk to procurement people, because then they can actually turn around to contractors and say, well, we've actually got a local supplier that we think you could work with. So I think some of it's about building trust with institutions as well, but I think part of the problem is actually systemic in the way in which our procurement's set up at the moment.
That trust network's there already.
Yeah.
We've got the biggest possible example to lean back on in COVID.
absolutely.
in the way that money would directly re-channeled to the community sector and people on the ground, and on a basis of trust, because that trust network was there through those national networks. So it's not like we've got to prove
Reinvent it, yeah.
that can be done, because we've seen it done and it worked, and everybody said, oh, we'll never go back, this is the way that we're doing it, and we can see that we've gone back harder and faster than, so why do you guys think that it wasn't listened to? Or
Why have we gone back?
Why have we carried on? We just carried on because, you know, we saw council officers suddenly getting their mojo back because they were like not having to go through 15 committees to get anything done.
Yeah.
Think something up, do it, and then act with a local agency to make it happen. You know? Why?
Can I tee you up for this one? Because I was just going to say, I was. All right,
Point.
can I was just going to tee you up
Do you want to answer that, then you
quick.
can come back in on the last point then.
But CLES had done a report, I think, on the good, the bad and the ugly, and there was like these 3 scenarios of where we could go post-COVID. And I think, to your point, Matt, we've kind of ended up back at ugly, and somewhere between ugly and bad in some ways. And I think, yeah, it's been, I think a lot of the lessons from COVID have been forgotten. We've tried to just get back on with the way we used to do things, but you might have more context on that from the kind of CLES perspective.
I'm just going to flip back to the procurement one and then I'll come directly to yours if that's okay. So I know I said before I wanted to move community wealth building out of the kind of legislative context and put it down here, but I think around procurement, actually this is where we do need legislation. And that's what I would really like to see coming out of the community wealth building bill, because actually at the moment England has a better and more supportive procurement landscape than Scotland. It's more progressive. That never happens. So we need to be looking at how we lock contracts, how we can make it easier for smaller suppliers, how we can just make that a more supportive space. So hopefully the government are thinking about that. And also just to kind of pick in and around, there's an awareness raising piece, and COVID absolutely did that. And we saw that, and specifically to Fife Council, possibly because they were already on a community wealth building journey. But during COVID, they really were able to gain all this knowledge about who was out there doing what, who could deliver what, how that could look. So their economic development professionals were like, wow, great. Hey, let's direct some of our procurement spend to these guys. Let's tell them about our pipeline. Let's make it easier. Fife Council, quite frankly, have done a really good job around procurement and really hammering it into their local economy to make it work. So it absolutely can happen. And on a kind of larger scale, I would look to the Glasgow Health Board region. They've just done a piece of work directly thinking about how they can get people into their procurement chain from different ethnic backgrounds, women, different, they've really thought about, hey, we're just kind of giving money to middle-aged white men who are running companies, and maybe we want to kind of diversify that a little bit. So I think there's an appetite out there from some places, and I think there's more we can do to kind of push it out there. But yeah, I do think for a lot of places we have gone back to the ugly, and that's because of power. It's risk aversion. It's just that feeling of fear, I guess. But it is possible, and so it's showing and pointing to the possible and saying, you know what, Fife can do it, why can't Dumfries and Galloway?
So along with the legislative, because obviously then that would help, so that people then have to, okay. Yes, Helen. I'll come. Okay, you come in, then I'll come to you, Helen.
So just going on what you're saying there is that it's a great example of Fife and Glasgow and stuff, but how then, if we're going to go bottom up, how do people at the bottom influence those guys at the top? It's okay, sitting back going, yeah, Fife have done a great job. How do we influence Dumfries and Galloway Council to serve us as the people?
So it is about building those relationships, and it's those connections. It's awareness raising. It's letting them know what you can do, and maybe it's not you alone. It's maybe you in a collaboration with others to say, you know what, we can deliver this. What do you need?
And I know that it's been challenging, and you're saying things are stalled, but you've been building quite interesting relationships in the work that you've been doing. I think around the land, it's slow, takes a long time, but
It is very
it is maybe
slow.
opens possibilities,
Yes,
would you say?
Oh, sure. I mean, there are some silver linings, and I suppose I'm always really impatient. I just think, right, we know this stuff now. We've done the research, we've done the studies. We just need to crack on and do it. It just seems like the obvious thing to me. The money's there from the private sector, certainly. So it's frustrating to have to move so slowly. Yeah. But, for me, it is, you've mentioned relationships, I think, a couple of times already, and having those long-term relationships is just so important. So people understand the communities they're working and operating in, which I think there's a big gap there at the moment. At the moment, there's no need for someone who's coming in, operating, at large scale, whether it's wind, forestry, any other type of infrastructure. There's no requirement for them to know the people where they're working at all, So I think if we could, put some onus on that, and that doesn't cost anything, at the end of the day, apart from a bit more of people's time, which is obviously always of a premium. But, I think in terms of support for procurement locally and for small operators, that needs a huge amount of support and facilitation and transparency and training and work around the language of procurement. Because you speak to your average small business or, whether that's a creative or some other type of business, all of this language is just like a sort of opaque
And
another
that's
world.
where, there was this, and I haven't read it, but there was when you were saying the report that was launched, was it yesterday? Or around the cooperatives, different models, that looks, Tuesday, that looks really interesting. So we'll try and collect some links as well from some of this. And Patrick, if you want to come in, and then I'm going to come to you, Helen.
Just sort of building on that, I think that's absolutely right. If you can demonstrate to your local stakeholders and politicians the capacity and the capability that you have in the community, that's one thing. I think the other thing is, I guess, storytelling, showing case studies of what's been achieved elsewhere. Because what you really want to do is get, whether it's your local councillor or whoever, the confidence to go in and say, well, hang on a minute, they're doing it in Fife, they're doing it in Glasgow. Actually, look at what they're doing in Manchester. Why the hell can't we do it here? And if you're armed with that, then you're giving them the confidence. And the politicians will want to be able to demonstrate benefit to their community. That's really what they want to do. So giving them the tools and the confidence to go and argue for that, I think you can make some really, really good inroads.
Question, Helen, and then you the question as well, and then Ed. Helen first.
Yeah, my question was largely around how do we influence the national anchor organisation, the institutional anchors. So I think that you maybe covered that. So I'm just going to be a tiny bit negative, which I think people who know me maybe know that I'm not naturally, but I am getting beaten down as the chief exec of a small base-based charity who does community wealth building on the ground with people like Morag. We're very close to it. Everything that Morag has talked about, I think almost without exception, you've done for free. So just to be completely clear about that, and I'm hearing a lot of, you need to do storytelling, you need to demonstrate capability, you need to show them, you need to change their mind. The reason I was late was because I was filling in funding applications. I'm living in a world where we're doing this on the ground over and over again, and on a micro scale, but I know we're doing it well. But why are the institutions proactively coming to us? Rob, SOSI is a community wealth building. Why aren't, to be a little bit negative, why isn't SOSI coming to us saying, how can we help you? Why is it an uphill battle with the council all the time? I don't know if we've managed to get yourself, Naomi, in front of Dawn Roberts, because for me that's where the conversations need to be happening. Ellen, I know at a regional level you absolutely are lobbying, and we're working with our TSI that they are very proactive. But you know what, it just feels like a lot of freelance, volunteer, poorly paid community sector, and I wish that the institutional anchors would come to us. So there's no point us all complaining about that in this room, agreeing. What can we do to make that happen?
So I'm gonna take.
Sorry.
I'm gonna take the three. I was just looking at time. I'm gonna take the three questions at once, and I'm gonna write down resource and capacity, and then I'm gonna give everybody a chance to come in on this one. So, what was your question?
Yeah. First thing, just a quick observation. It seems to me that we don't talk enough about values and ideology and worldview within this. When the well-being economy fundamentally will only succeed if there's a shift in that's necessary. I think that we have that understanding of that conceptually. If we're going to challenge that worldview effectively, and I think it is disturbing amongst that how many officers in local authorities and government talk about community wealth building as the thing that is going to save us within this crisis, and you have absolutely no idea, you know, of the extent of power sharing that's going to be required to bring that about. And I think that's just a sort of baseline that we face at the moment. My actual question, though, was a technical question that was related to the context of community ownership and the relationship between community anchor organisations and community anchor networks, which I find really useful kind of way of understanding that. I work for Scottish Community Development Centre, and what we're seeing at the moment is a response to cuts across Scotland by an active promotion of community ownership. But it's not about community wealth building, it's about asset disposal, and it's about the foisting of assets that are not viable in communities as an alternative to promotion. You do hear some officers saying, but it's about community wealth building. So I think my question is, have you come across examples where other methods of community control have worked in a community wealth building context, like public community partnerships, where public anchor networks continue to hold some of the risk, retain ownership of the building, and communities maximise the community wealth building context? The reason I ask this is because we're just reviewing the Empowerment Act at the moment. In our view, we've gone on the record in saying this, is that far too much emphasis on community ownership as the only liberating element of empowerment, and not enough on community influence of other decisions. And we're hoping the review would be an opportunity to reset that. I doubt if it will, but I think it's important in the CWD agenda that if you see the potential for different forms of control options is also serving community wealth building, we should be articulating that.
Okay.
Sorry if that's a bit long, but it's...
No, but really, and you know, we've got the afternoon as well to get into some of this, so I'm going to get these three questions, and then you can come in and watch bits here, really, and I'll remind you. Ed, what's yours?
I mean, I would echo a lot of what Helen was saying already, and you know, I think there needs to be courage from some of our key sort of political leaders, our funders, not just to talk about community wealth building, but to actually walk the walk. You know, I mean, we continually find challenges about how we demonstrate the value for what we do, and it still comes back to hard economics. Is what we're asked to report on, and it seems to me that there is an opportunity there to start looking at what are some of those other metrics that we could be measuring our sort of progression against, and how do we recognise that some of those metrics, they're not going to happen within just a 12-month funding sort of programme or a 2-year funding programme. Some of them are the long term that we have to be looking at, that are going to be over multiple years. Just picking up on the procurement issue as well, I mean, you know, we personally have found that a real challenge, and I think there needs to be changes in our local authorities about how they look at procurement from third sector bodies. You know, to the point where we've been involved in working with some of our local authority partners and actually developing up initiatives, spent considerable time over multiple years working out funding bids, and then we're told that we actually have to put in through public procurement Scotland to deliver that project, that initiative. And yet we've done all the legwork unpaid to actually realise that and get that funding position. So I think there needs to be a whole review of how procurement works and that relationship with third sector organisations.
Okay, so what that could look like. Okay, so this is tricky, but we don't need to answer all the questions. So we've got a question really around the resource and capacity that you know, we're asked to do things, but often people are doing it for free, and people really are at burnout. I think everybody sort of knows that. We've got one really around the community ownership, which also hits that resource and capacity, where actually, you know, I'm sure David has something to say around the challenges that we've had with Old School Thorn Hill as well, you know, where it's like loads of work, but really just need that support, that investment to make, you know, a transition, and so that everything being on the community ownership is challenging. And then something around, you know, the metrics and, you know, what we're, the short term and the long term, what we're asked to report on, but also with procurement, and I think this maybe also comes into some of those cooperative models. We talked about networks, different models that might support organisations to go through procurement processes, which are currently actually still incredibly exclusive. So you don't have to come in on all those points, just something that you feel, and I'm going to go through everyone. Naomi, do you want to start?
Yeah.
No. Pass.
Yeah.
And there can be provocations for the afternoon discussions because, you know, on the metrics one, if people are coming up with things like just write stuff down on the boards, in fact, even though the questions don't ask you that, just, I'm going to put some post-its out, just write stuff down. We're going to be collecting it all together. Yeah.
I've got thoughts for all of them. They're not always articulate, so come to me later if I haven't touched on the question. Yeah, resource is really tough. It is. And I don't have an easy answer there. I do think that there's an opportunity about pooling things. I don't have an example of that working either, but I think there maybe is something there. And it is unfair. And it is a power imbalance. And I wish I had something more tangible or concrete or helpful to say, other than that I recognise it and I mention it quite frequently in some of my conversations with some of the local authorities I engage with. No, I don't have any other examples, but I will ask the CLES hive mind because they're all over the rest of the country. So I'll come back on that to you if that's all right. Take my details, drop me a line and I'll come back to you. But yeah, I absolutely agree. There is a lot of asset transfers or opportunities for asset transfers. Here, have this wonderful resource going. You'll lose it forever. And communities are almost forced to take that journey. And it's maybe not the right time, and it's maybe not the right resource, but they just don't want to lose it. That's rubbish as well, quite frankly. Dear, it's all going to end very negatively with me here. I think there should be more partnership working. I don't know that there is, but I'll speak to the rest of the UK team and see. And I still need to think about metrics, so let's do that and I'll come back.
Right, same thing. I've got something to say on all of them and I'll try and keep it as tight as I can, probably fail. 100% back up what Helen was saying. Obviously, me and Helen work together all the time and I couldn't do a fraction of what I do without Helen's help, and Helen, funding is always at risk for anchor organisations, and I think we almost need to find a way of just making that funding secure for people, and also looking at the kind of multiplier of value that an anchor organisation adds. You get a lot more than what you put in financially, I would say, and if there's a metric for measuring that, it could be really helpful. And I really agree with what she said on that we need to shift the onus from it all being the local community and the local anchor organisations advocating for this change, and to put some onus onto the agencies and the private companies to have the responsibility for bringing that resource forward. Not just the financial resource, but the human resource of sitting down and facilitating. You talked about examples. There was an example with one of the wind farm companies that came in Vattenfall. They actually have a community benefit person in-house for their company. So not just someone who, I think I've got this right, Susie can put me right if I'm wrong, who actually looks strategically at community benefit for Vattenfall. And then they have project officers who are kind of dedicated to the projects and try and work out how to strategise the best spend of the money on the ground. And that's a real resource around those conversations that need to happen, that really helps the communities, and they're available, and they bring ideas. So that is an example of that happening, but it's a rare example, I would say, in my experience.
Yeah, I think the thing that marks them out is that they've got lived experience, if you like, of community development in their specific sector, and what works and what doesn't work, and they're taking that into their other projects, so it benefits the other projects. That's not that.
And then just on examples of slightly different models for agency out with ownership, Forestry and Land Scotland do have different management leases. There's lots of places up north actually that have got kind of memorandums of understanding now with communities, so they don't have to own the asset outright. People like the Woodland Trust might have come in and bought it, but they've got an MOU and they've got good bringing that agency in through governance, and the board structure having sort of a minimum amount of community representation. And, you know, we are just starting to see the first sort of private leases coming through in the land sector as well, where they're leasing back a bit of land to the community. So it's not so much around the building urban space, but it is happening a little tiny bit in land.
Manish?
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it? It's really tough. I think your point is spot on. I think we have taken advantage of the third sector as society to plug the gap where the state is no longer able to fill that gap. I think we need a new deal for the third sector. I think it's got to come from the top. I actually think government's got to look at this and look at how we actually put more money on the table and make sure we can release resources in other places and spaces. I think there's something in there as well just about leaders in the third sector. I think I have been one. We're tired. We've got a weary workforce. I think people are tired generally. We've just been dealing with this poly crisis, but I think our leadership is tired in the third sector, and I think there's something about making sure you've got the right people on the bus for the next journey as well, and making sure you're the right person to steer the bus as well sometimes. But actually, you know, I think we need to do more to just shore up leadership generally, right across Scottish civil society. You know, if you look around, there's going to be a lot of people retiring in the next few years, and the cohorts of people in behind them, I don't think we've put the work in because we've pulled out programmes that were there maybe in the past around support leadership. So I do think I've got quite a keen interest in looking at governance and leadership and making sure we've actually got the right governance and leadership, but we can't do any of that without money. And I think anchor institutions, and maybe there's something in this as a takeaway, is I think if we could help people think about how you navigate anchor institutions and where you could try and find money, because actually lots of academics sit on pots of money sometimes. They've got to do practice with communities. Often they'll just do that with people they know, and it doesn't necessarily go out to tender or anything like that. But there is often even sometimes little pots of money, which I know for a charity could go quite far. So I do think there's maybe something in helping the third sector think about how to work more effectively with anchor institutions, and where, you know, there's lots of joint funding calls coming out. More and more in academia, they're looking for practitioners to work alongside academics, and some of those calls will fund up to 80% of costs, including salaries. So that it might well be it's about expanding how we think about the traditional funding models. There's a bit in this, I think, as well, looking at philanthropy and looking at, you know, how do we access that philanthropy better, but how do we actually pool resources? And then just in the context of Scotland, we're not a big country, but we've got a lot of charities, we've got a lot of third sector organisations, and maybe there's something about joining forces more than we do sometimes. Maybe it's about actually looking at, you know, is it about merging, is it about just working together more effectively? But I think you need space and time to do that, and I think part of the problem is we've not given leaders that, and so I think there's something to consider there, but I'm not quite sure how we do it. Sometimes just even being in a community of practice or an actual learning set where you can go and, you know, let off some steam, but also get something productive off the back of it. I thought your bit about values is really key actually to a lot of the work that we do, and, you know, if we get our values right with our community wealth building work, hopefully we can translate that into how we talk to government, how we talk to private sector. Private sector's got money, and I think that's another partner that we need to look at working more closely with. And everybody should have a ESG strategy, and will have to report on their ESG activities. And so that's a really big opportunity, I think, for us to bring expertise that many of us might have around working with communities directly. I think the last point I was going to make is this piece around ecosystem development, and it's a slightly overused word, I think, ecosystems, you know, but a really thriving ecosystem does have, you know, very little friction. It's got osmosis, that you can move in and around those anchor institutions quite freely, that you can work with local businesses. It's about place as much as it is about anything else. And so how do you develop that ecosystem? And I think some of that is getting the right people round the table and having a go. I think there is a bit of pioneering. I think we've got to have a bit of a pioneering spirit with some of this stuff. If it's not happening and there's a gap there, but I don't take away from the fact that that is also relying on people's goodwill and labour, and so it's about trying to make sure that it's worth your while in the longer run, and I think some of that starts with trying to get money out of government if we can.
Okay, thanks. Patrick,
Just
for you?
I think, yeah, okay, let's try and go through them. I mean, on resources, no easy answer. You know, I mean, Wheel Scotland is 3.5 people on the half, and you know, our funding is it's just hand to mouth. But one of the things we do though is that we do speak with big funding organisations to try and get them to change their mindset, so they can take a longer term view and try and deal with the causes of problems rather than continually trying to mop up the symptoms. Whether that bears fruit or not, I don't know, but that's the kind of conversations we have on a regular basis. And I think values and ideology are absolutely at the heart of this, and unless we really change some of the values behind the way that we've designed the economic system, then we're just going to continue to repeat the mistakes. And those mistakes are getting more and more expensive. So actually the only way we can get out of this polycrisis that we have is actually completely rethink the way that the economy works. And we shouldn't get too depressed about that, because actually change can happen quite quickly. You know, I know not the best of circumstances, but I mean things like COVID, it did show how the public sector and the third sector could work completely differently in quite a short period of time. You know, talking about creatives, look at the post office and the power of that ITV drama, I say documentary, I mean, it virtually was a documentary. But I mean, the rate of change which happened on the back of that inspiring piece of drama was really quite remarkable. And I think I read somewhere, a sociologist can correct me on this, but you know, the tipping point in thinking is when about 25% of a population believes in something, and then very quickly it can tip into becoming the mainstream thought. So people are concerned about climate, concerned about their communities, they're concerned about poverty. Actually, if we can reach a tipping point, then we can really make some quite rapid change. On the asset transfer, it's really about risk, isn't it? The only example I can think of is there's a small housing association in Glasgow, which of course is an anchor institution in its own right within its community in the West End of Glasgow. It took over a failing community centre and took that risk, used its asset management skills to maintain and look after the building, but kept the ethos of it becoming a free-to-use or virtually free-to-use community asset. So there may be a way in which you can work with some of the anchor institutions to share some of that risk with the community. Don't know.
And I think historically there have been thousands of these. I think our frustration is that since the Community Development Act, ironically, there have been fewer people have been forced to take ownership. So, but that one, for example, was a council asset, it was a community asset, but it transferred to the housing association as part of that. And we won't work in every community, obviously, but you know, there are examples of a bigger institution with that kind of social purpose at its core, taking some of that risk, which means that it can be brought into community ownership. Measures, absolutely. One of the key things the wellbeing economy argues for is a different form of measurement of the economy. We sort of centre on things called cornerstone indicators. We can probably get into those in some of the workshops, but they're basically indicators of progress that mean things to the community. They're derived from the community, and then we look at the evidence we can use to back up.
Can you say that again? What indicators?
Cornerstone indicators.
Cornerstone indicators. Yeah. We can pick up on in the workshop, just at the time.
Yeah, we better go into breaks.
And finally on procurement, I mean, I think my sense at the moment, and I don't have any research on this, is that a lot of community benefit is really just the crumbs. And really, we need to argue for much greater involvement of communities in sharing the benefits, particularly of things like wind farms. I mean, £5,000 a gigawatt or whatever it is peanuts. There's much more ownership, much more direct benefit directly into communities, and actually more community ownership of the assets, which are generating that power for the benefit of the community.
Thank you. And thank you very much to all our panellists. I know that there are lots of sort of questions, but I think also we've been talking quite a while. I think we can have a break and tea and coffee. Just before we're going into that, I think just to say that there's a lot coming out around examples different examples of where this is working, both historically. I think there's loads of historical examples of all sorts that we've moved away from to learn from, instead of always having to do it brand new. So it would be nice to capture as many of those today, to share those with each other, and like I said, to write them down. I'm going to put some post-its next to these boards, and anything that you've heard, if it doesn't come out in the breakout sessions, feel free to write down. Indicators, what does that look like? Why is that, working? And also for me, maybe on a positive note, I think there's been conversations around how maybe not doing it in isolation, so the role of networks, and different working models, and that's one of the breakout sessions this afternoon, is what are the different types of working models and decision-making structures, cooperatives, other ways that people who might not be able to go through a procurement process like it currently stands could come together with others to go through that procurement process. That's certainly something we're looking at the Stove. So we're going to take a break. We're going to take 15 minutes. So we're going to come back together at, I'll give you 4, it's not quiz. 1, 2. We're going to take 10, 12 minutes. So go get another drink, and then I'll call you back and we'll do breakout sessions. Thank you for the...